All right, I want you to do something for me as we get going. I want everyone just to take a really deep breath. Ready? On the count of three. 1, 2, 3. It's probably the last time you'll do that for the rest of the month. I mean, when you think about everything that you have going on between now and the end of the month, I tried to write down a list of everything going on. I'm going to try to say it in a single breath. You ready? Christmas concerts, recitals, Christmas parties, work party, neighborhood party, decorations, ornaments, putting up lights, shopping, wrapping, distributing, baking, cookie decorating, Christmas cards, Christmas movies, Elf, Christmas Story, The Grinch, travel, card trip, plane trip, feast, prep, consume the feast, clean up, travel home, return the presents, undecorate, and sleep. You're going to do all of that in the next month. It's quite busy. And you know, when life gets really full, when life gets really busy, interruptions, those things that aren't necessarily in the plan, they become more and more unpleasant, don't they? It's almost like, life's a balloon and it's filled to the max. And all of a sudden, you interject something that's unexpected into the equation and the balloon just can't hold anymore. It feels like life's just going to pop. I don't know about you, but I can get quite annoyed by interruptions sometimes. My idea of a perfect day is when I have the plan sort of laid out and I can execute it to a T, everything can get done. But that rarely ever happens, right? There's always interruptions. Traffic, sickness, something unexpected will come up at work. Something will break at home that needs your attention. There's always interruptions. The question that I want to ask today, a lot of times we kind of are like a running back, and we have our idea of what the plan is. And as soon as we see an interruption coming, we stiff arm it, right? And we try to just keep going with the plan. My question today is, what if the interruption is from God? What if the unexpected thing that comes into your life is actually from the hand of God? Because we run the risk. Those of us who prize efficiency, who prize productivity, who love to make a to-do list and check things off, we run the risk, if we're not careful, of stiff-arming the very opportunities that God sends our way. The people all throughout the Bible. The Bible is just the record of God's interactions with people as He unfolded His plan of redemption. They struggled with this too. They had no idea God was going to come into their life when He did. It was unexpected to them. And that's certainly the case for the woman we're going to look at this morning. If you were with us last week, we're talking about the cast of Christmas. When God came down to earth in the form of a baby, there was a handful of characters who God used in a special way. And, because of our familiarity with these people, we tend to kind of view them more like actors and actresses in a play. We see them in nativity scenes. We see them in Christmas pageants. So we kind of forget that they're real people. And so what we've been doing is we're going to take a look at a different person each week and sort of put ourselves in their shoes and ask, what do we learn from their interactions with God? And so this morning we're going to look at Mary, the mother of Jesus. This woman who gets way too much attention from the Catholic Church and who gets way too little attention from Protestant churches. We're going to put ourselves in Mary's shoes and ask God, what do you have to teach us? The story of what happened to Mary was carefully researched by a doctor named Luke. He went and talked with Mary. He heard all about her, what happened to her, and then he wrote it down towards the end of the first century. He wrote it down in his gospel called Luke. And we're going to be in chapter 1. And what we're going to see is that Mary has an opportunity. Mary has an opportunity, then Mary makes a response, and then we're going to talk about Mary's mindset. All right, so that's sort of where we're going. If you have your Bibles, or if there's one in front of you, you can turn to Luke chapter 1. We're going to pick up the story in verse 26. We're going to look at the passage that was kind of in between what we looked at last week. Luke 1, verse 26. In the 6th month of Elizabeth's pregnancy, God sent the angel Gabriel to Nazareth, a town in Galilee, to a virgin pledged to be married to a man named Joseph, a descendant of David. The virgin's name was Mary. So the angel Gabriel's back on the move. Last week we saw the angel Gabriel. He was in the temple with Zechariah. So now 6 months later, the angel Gabriel goes north, goes to Nazareth, and he meets Mary. And it says he meets her in a small, dusty town in the middle of nowhere called Nazareth. We know it's in the middle of nowhere because he has to give a qualifier. It's in Nazareth, a town in Galilee. No one would have heard of it had it not had a town in Galilee. They wouldn't even know where it is. It's sort of like if, in a couple weeks when I go to Baltimore to visit my family, if someone said, hey, where do you live now? If I said I live in Benbrook, people in Baltimore would have no idea where that was. But if I said I live in Benbrook, a suburb of Fort Worth, now they'll know exactly where. Well, that's sort of what he's doing here. Nazareth is this really small place. People wouldn't know about it. So Gabriel comes to Mary. And from this very verse alone, we actually know a decent amount about Mary. It says she's a virgin pledged to be married. Now, the first thing we know from just that phrase alone is that we know her age. She's probably 12 or 13, maybe 14 years old. In that society, as soon as girls went through puberty, that was when they would get engaged. The men were usually a little bit older because they had to save up money for the dowry price to pay to the girl's father. So Joseph was probably a little bit older, but Mary's probably 12, 13, or 14. So we know her age. Probably something else we know is a little bit of what Mary's life looked like. Anyone have a different word than the word pledged? A virgin pledged to be married. Anyone have a different word in yours? What do you have? Betrothed. Yeah, that's a better word for this. Betrothal is a very different thing than our engagement. We're very familiar with the engagement process here. To be betrothed is very different. That's a binding legal relationship. In that society, the parents arranged the marriages, which now that I'm a parent, I think that's a pretty good idea. The parents sort of, when it was time, they made an agreement. Okay, my daughter will marry your son marry my daughter, and it was a binding legal arrangement. But they probably even decided it well before even that moment. Probably years before, as they're growing up in the same town, they probably had it sort of worked out. So we live a couple houses down from the Glancers, and our oldest Madison and their youngest Jackson, they're 4. So if we lived in that society, our families live 2 houses away from each other, we watch our kids grow up, we respect them, they respect us. Probably even at age 6 or 7, we decide, you know what? Let's have them get married. In fact, if you want to decide, I'll sign today. But that's probably what happened with Mary and Joseph. It was probably planned for a while, and then when Mary finally went through puberty, they decided, all right, let's make this binding, let's make this legal. I'm not sure if they actually signed or how they did it. Maybe it was a shake of the hand. But this was a binding legal agreement, such that the only way you could break it was through death or divorce. And if the man dies during this betrothal period, the woman's considered a widow for the rest of her life. This is very different than our engagement. Now, what happened during this betrothal period? The woman's responsibility, Mary's responsibility during this period is to prove her faithfulness, to not give herself to anyone else, to prove her purity, to stay faithful to Joseph. The man's responsibility during this period is to go prepare a home, to make a place for them to live. So Joseph, probably on his parents' house, would be building an addition, creating a space for them to live for the end of their betrothal period. And both families would be preparing for this wedding feast. The wedding feast would last 7 days. And you talk to any bride who's getting married today, or even remember your own wedding, you remember how much work went into it, right? And that was for a 45-minute ceremony and a 3-hour party. Imagine preparing for a 7-day feast. So life was busy for Mary. She's proven her faithfulness to Joseph. She's preparing for a wedding feast. But on top of all of that, she has all of the other responsibilities. She still lives within her parents' household. And they didn't have all the conveniences that we have. So she every day is fetching water and cleaning the house and preparing meals, taking care of the barns. Life was full for Mary, and all of a sudden, an angel shows up. We don't know exactly what she was doing, but an angel shows up. She was for sure doing something. Verse 28. The angel went to her and said, "Greetings, you who are highly favored. The Lord is with you." Mary was greatly troubled at his words and wondering what kind of greeting this might be. Translation, she's freaking out. Everyone always freaks out when they see an angel, probably because they're very terrifying. But probably also, when you're in the presence of a holy angel, I think you're reminded of how unholy you are. And I think Mary probably expects judgment, because she knows she deserves it. So the angel reassures her, verse 30. The angel said to her, "Do not be afraid, Mary. You found favor with God. You will conceive, give birth to a son. You're to call him Jesus. He will be great, will be called the Son of the Most High. The Lord God will give him the throne of his father David, and he will reign over Jacob's descendants forever. His kingdom will never end." Now that is quite an announcement. There's a lot to take in. Gabriel says to Mary, "You're going to have a son. And this son's going to be the Messiah. It's going to be the Son of God, going to sit on the throne." But Mary, she can't think about all that Messiah stuff yet. She's still taking in the first part. She's wondering a little bit about the mechanics. How's this going to work? I've never been with a man. That's what she says in verse 34. She says, "How will this be?" Mary asked the angel, "Since I am a virgin." Now, Mary's young, but she didn't skip 5th grade health class. She knows a little bit about the birds and the bees. She says, "How is this going to work?" Interesting, last week Zechariah asked a question, and we can tell from the angel's response that it was a question of doubt. This doesn't appear to be a question of doubt. This is purely a question of, help me understand how this is going to happen. Because the angel actually answers her question, doesn't rebuke her at all. The angel, verse 35, the angel answered, "The Holy Spirit will come upon you. The power of the Most High will overshadow you. So the Holy One to be born will be called the Son of God. Even Elizabeth, your relative, is going to have a child in her old age, and she who is in her 6th month, who has been unable to conceive, is in her 6th month. For no word from God will ever fail." Now put yourself in Mary's shoes. Here's the first idea that really jumped out at me, and that is that God's opportunities often interrupt, and they come at a high cost. I mean, talk about an interruption. Mary's going about her life. She's in this betrothal period. She's proving her faithfulness. She's planning a wedding feast. She's doing all the daily tasks of helping run a home. And all of a sudden, an angel shows up, wanting to change the course of her day, wanting to change the course of her engagement, wanting to change the course of her life. Interrupts her. And think of the cost that this would have on Mary. Scandal. A virgin pregnancy, really, come on. I mean, this would have brought shame on herself. This would have brought shame on her family, probably even her whole town. And this is a shame-based culture. I mean, she had probably no idea what this was going to mean for her and Joseph. Her whole responsibility right now is to prove her faithfulness to Joseph. And now she winds up pregnant. She had to think her and Joseph were over. So she's probably wondering, what, am I going to be alone the rest of my life? She couldn't see how this was going to play out. I mean, this was a huge interruption to her life with an extremely high cost. God's opportunities often interrupt. Last week I was talking with a guy from Trinity, and he was telling me about a trip home from Thanksgiving. He stopped at a gas station with his family, and he looked over and he saw a Suburban with 7 people in it, all with long faces, because the hood was up, and it wasn't going anywhere. And he said in that moment, he could kind of tell this was sort of an opportunity from God. But at that same moment that he saw there's an opportunity to help, he saw there's a pretty significant cost. Stop and help them. I mean, they're at the gas station. They still have 2 more hours till they get home. God's opportunities, they often interrupt, and they often come with a cost. This is how God's opportunities almost always feel. You know, you and I, we're probably not going to get an angel. We may. But God still has his ways of making his opportunities pretty clear to us. You know, there are these gentle nudges. There are these sort of gentle pushes, usually when we encounter a need of some kind, a need that we can meet. God has his way of saying, I have that for you. You know, so maybe you're talking with one of your friends, and all of a sudden they sort of open up about something they're struggling with. And you feel that sort of gentle nudge to encourage, to support, to listen, to pray for them. Maybe it's a coworker at work, and they've never, ever said anything about spiritual things. And all of a sudden, they mention God or something. And you just, in that moment, you know hey, God's opening a window here to have a conversation. Maybe it's a financial need that you hear of. Maybe it's someone in your community group and they're just underwater from a lot of medical bills, and you know, hey, I could help them. And you sort of feel God's prodding. Maybe it's a student who's raising money to go on a missions trip, or it's someone you know at church and they're struggling financially, they need to keep the heat on or something, and you know God's sort of pushing you. You can be a part of that. Maybe it's more to do with time. You know, like you heard this morning, that there's a need for 2 kindergarten teachers once a month. And this is just how God works. You're sitting there and you're thinking, I could do that. I love kids. That could be me. And you sort of feel God's gentle leading, His gentle bidding. You know, whatever words you put to it, His call, His leading, His nudge, His bidding, whenever those things come, it always interrupts what we're doing. And there's always some sort of cost associated with it. You know, maybe it's a financial cost. Well, if I give my money to that, I'm not going to have money to do. Maybe it's more of a time. You know, I don't really have time for that. So if I give my time to that, I'm going to have to take it from over here. Maybe it's a reputation cost. If I open my mouth and talk about that, what are they going to think of me? There's always a cost that comes when we respond to God's opportunities. I think there's sort of this misconception among believers that, you know, when we're following God's will, when we're doing what He asks us to do, things are going to be perfectly smooth. Life's going to work out just perfectly. Everything's going to turn to gold. There's not going to be a cost. And I think Mary would say no. God always interrupts, and there's a huge cost that comes. So God puts this opportunity in front of Mary. He says, Mary, I want you to play a significant role in all of redemptive history. I want you to be the mother of the Messiah. How's she going to respond? I imagine all of heaven was sort of on their tiptoes waiting. Is she going to participate or not? What's she going to do? Let's look at her response. It's amazing. Verse 38. Mary says this, I am the Lord's servant. Mary answered, may your word to me be fulfilled. Then the angel left her. This has to be one of the best sentences in the whole Bible. She says, I am the Lord's servant. May your word to me be fulfilled. And that's remarkable. God had completely interrupted her life, interrupted her day, her engagement, her whole future. And all of a sudden, I'm the Lord's servant. The cost was going to be huge. And yet, without hesitation, she responds, count me in. I'm all for it. I'm the Lord's servant. And the question I found myself asking all week is, how does she respond like this? Because I know if I were in her place, well, not exactly her place, but if when I'm in situations like that don't interrupt nearly that much and have a fraction of the cost, I stiff arm them so I can keep doing what I had planned. So how does she have this response? What's her mindset that sort of allows her to have this response? Really, the question is, how can we have that same mindset so that when God brings His opportunities to us, we don't push them away, but we embrace them like she does? So I want us to look at Mary's mindset, and we sort of get a glimpse of this from looking at what happens next. And remember, we talked about this a little last week. Mary, after this point, she just heard her relative Elizabeth's pregnant, so she packs up and takes this 100-mile journey to her relative. And remember, when she gets there, Elizabeth doesn't know she's pregnant, but when the baby inside Elizabeth jumps at Mary's greeting, Elizabeth says, you're pregnant. And then I imagine that had to be such a relief to Mary. It probably took her a week or so to travel to Elizabeth. And I imagine the whole time she was dreading telling them. How in the world are they going to believe her that she's pregnant and yet still a virgin? I imagine she was just dreading, how am I going to tell them? And yet the first thing when she shows up, she already knows. Blessed is the fruit of your womb. Blessed are you because you believed what the angel told you. So Elizabeth already knows. I imagine this sort of relief just washed over Mary. And then what she does next is she writes a song. She sings this song. Remember, she's a 13 or 14-year-old girl. And she takes parts of the Old Testament and she puts some of her own thoughts in there, and she weaves this beautiful song. Whole denominations of churches sing this song often. It's called the Magnificat. But what I want to do is I want us to look a little bit at this song, because I think we see Mary's mindset in it. The mindset that allowed her, when God interrupted her life, at a high cost, for her to just say, I'm the Lord's servant. I think we get a glimpse of her mindset. So we can't look at the whole song, but look at verse 46. Here's Mary's song. My soul glorifies the Lord, and my spirit rejoices in God my Savior. For he has been mindful of the humble state of his servant. From now on, all generations will call me blessed, for the Mighty One has done great things for me. Holy is his name. Down to verse 52. He has brought down rulers from their thrones, but has lifted up the humble. Do you hear her mindset in there? The first thing that really stood out in her mindset is her humility. She has an accurate view of herself. Mary knows that she's a humble slave of God. She knows that's who she is. She doesn't have a chip on her shoulder that, she's pretty special because God chose her to have this unique role. There's none of that. She knows she's this poor girl, nothing going for her, from a no-name town that God just decided to use. She's nothing. She had a correct assessment of herself. In fact, you see how she refers to herself? She says, I'm the Lord's servant. And then verse 48, he's been mindful of the humble state of his servant. In fact, this is not really a great translation. This word servant comes from the word doulos. It really means slave. There's 6 or 7 words that mean servant that they could have used. This is the word slave. The reason our English Bibles stay away from the word slave is because all the connotations that we have from racial slavery of the 17th, 18th, and 19th century. Slavery was different then. So to try to keep us from thinking of that kind of slavery, they use the word servant. But this really means the word slave. And Mary's honored to be God's slave. There's no better place she can think of being. It's a humble place. In fact, you look throughout your New Testament, it's one of the favorite identities that almost all the New Testament writers use. Paul, when he starts his letters, he says you need to know 2 things as he starts. He's like, I, Paul. Yeah, that's who I am, but that's not what's important. I, Paul, a slave of Christ. That's what's important. Peter starts his letters the same way. Even James. If I were James, I think I would love to sort of name drop that I'm the half-brother of Jesus. Give some clout to who I am. James, a slave of Christ. Early Christians just boasted in the fact we get to be the slave of God. He's the master. We're so humble. These are the spiritual elite of early Christianity. They're the ones who are founding these churches. And yet they have zero pride at all. I'm a slave of God. That's who I am. This is our fundamental identity. We're slaves of God, slaves of Christ. He calls the shots, not us. We do his bidding. He doesn't do ours. I think some think, okay, let's add Jesus to our already full lives. They'd say, no. When you trust Christ, you give yourself completely to him. You're his now. Your life is his. He calls the shots. When we view ourselves like this, God's opportunities, they're not interruptions anymore. He's the one calling the shots. It might feel like an interruption because we had something planned, but there's nothing we want more than to do the bidding of the one that we love. Slaves know it's not about them. It's about the master. Mary's so humble. She knows it's all about God and what he wants. Now, you don't become humble by just trying to be humble. You don't just say, okay, I'm going to be more humble. That's not how you become humble. The way you become humble is you see something greater than yourself. You see something incredibly beautiful, incredibly amazing, and then you realize, oh, okay, I know who I am now. And so that's the second thing we see about Mary's mindset that allowed her to respond and say, I'm the Lord's servant, is that she knew God as huge and trustworthy. We see this mindset all over her song. Just look at the first few verses again. She says, "My soul glorifies the Lord. My spirit rejoices in God, my Savior. He's been mindful of the humble state of his servant. From now on, generations will call me blessed, for the mighty one has done great things for me. Holy is his name." God is huge to Mary. The first line, "My soul glorifies the Lord." Do any of you have a different word for that word, glorify? Exalts. The real word is the word magnifies. That's where we get Magnificat from this word. And think about it. She says, "My soul magnifies the Lord." What does that even mean? Now think of magnification. Now think back to high school science class. Magnification is an important piece to science. In fact, there's two different instruments that you use to magnify things. You use a microscope and you use a telescope. A microscope is used to make something that's extremely small bigger so that you can study it. But a telescope's just the opposite. A telescope takes something that's huge and tries to magnify it so that you can actually see how big it really is. Mary's talking about the telescope kind of magnification. She knows God is enormous. And she says, through my praise, through my life, through my decisions, I'm going to try to make God look as big as he really is. That's what she's saying. She says, my soul magnifies the Lord. She knows God is huge. I like how John Piper says it. He says, the whole duty of the Christian can be summed up in this: feel, think, and act in a way that will make God look as great as he really is. Every choice we make, we have an opportunity to make God look as big as he really is to the world around us. And Mary gets this. She knows she's following an incredibly big God. And so she's so willing to jump at his bidding, to do what he asks of her. She knows herself. She knows she's a humble slave. And she knows God, he is huge. So when he shows up, she drops everything to do what he asks her to do. Now, in light of this mindset, it's now really easy. You can go to the next slide. It's really easy to know then why I don't jump at the Lord's bidding. Because I don't really that often view myself as a humble slave of God. And very frequently, I don't view God as huge and trustworthy. I more often would view Jesus more like a business partner or an associate, a slave, a master. That not often do I view Jesus in the driver's seat. I'm more in one of those cars that have two steering wheels, both sides, and we'll both drive this car. Humble slave of God. Pride is what so often keeps us, I think, from jumping at God's opportunities he brings to us. Because pride, what it does is it sort of elevates us up and brings Jesus down a little bit, and we're kind of more on a level playing field. And when we're on a level playing field, well, why should I let you interrupt my life if we're equals? Now, we know this intellectually, but I feel like that's how it plays out often. Now, have you ever seen the movie Rocky? You know the movie Rocky? I'm not talking, I know they've made about 9 or 10 different Rockies. I'm talking about the first one, Rocky 1, the classic. You remember the scene right before the last huge fight, when Rocky goes out, his last training session. Remember this? He puts on that gray sweatpants and gray sweatsuit, and he just takes off running through the streets of Philadelphia. And before long, there's this whole crowd of kids running behind him. You remember this scene? It's pretty awesome. I've been running a lot. No kids ever come and follow me. So he's running through the streets of Philadelphia. In fact, people who know Philadelphia, he runs over a marathon in all the different places. But he runs through the streets of Philadelphia. Then all of a sudden he ends up at the museum where all those steps are. Remember, he runs up those steps. He gets to the top and he's cheering. He's boxing in the air. All these kids are sort of huddled around him. You remember this scene? I have a picture of this scene. A little dark, but what I want to do is draw your attention. You see that girl on the left in the green jacket? You see her kind of all the way on the left. Do you know who that is? Anyone know who that is, that girl in the green jacket? I don't either. I have no clue. It's the only time she's in the movie. She's in the movie for 5 whole seconds. But I just imagine every time she watches this movie, I imagine she's pointing herself out to everybody around. In fact, I can even picture, she has kids probably now, so she's getting her kids and bringing them around the TV, and the kids are like, no, Mom, not again. And she's like fast-forwarding to this scene, and she's like, guys, watch. Oh, you blinked. We got to go back. Come on. Now imagine she says to her kids, she says, hey, you know that movie Rocky? I'm the star of the show. It's really all about me. I'm the one who made it the classic that it is. If you heard her say that, you'd say, okay, I've got one word for you. Extra. Okay? You're nothing. You're in the movie for 5 seconds. The movie's about Rocky. And I kind of feel like this is a little bit how it is in life. That our pride kind of makes it feel like we're the star of the show. And when we're the star of the show, it's our agenda. It's our plans. They're what matter. Nothing can interrupt us. We're the stars. When in the reality, God's the star of the show. We're an extra. We'll do whatever He wants. We're His slaves. Pride's what so often keeps us from following these opportunities that God, I think, brings to us every day. But we sort of miss them because of pride. C.S. Lewis, I love what he says about pride. He has a whole chapter. He calls it the great sin. But allow me just to read a couple paragraphs of what he says about pride. He says, in God, you come up against something which in every respect is immeasurably superior to yourself. Unless you know God as that, and therefore know yourself as nothing, in comparison, you do not know God at all. As long as you're proud, you cannot know God. A proud man is always looking down on things and on people. And of course, as long as you're looking down, you can't see something that's above you. Now, this raises a terrible question. How is it that people who are quite obviously eaten up with pride can say that they believe in God and they appear themselves very religious? I'm afraid it means that they are worshiping an imaginary God. They theoretically admit themselves to be nothing in the presence of this phantom God, but are really all the time imagining how He approves of them, thinks them far better than other ordinary people. That is, they pay a pennyworth of imaginary humility to Him to get out a pound's worth of pride toward their fellow men. I suppose it was of these people that Christ was thinking when He said that they would preach about Him and they would cast out devils in His name, only to be told at the end of the world that He never knew them. And any of us, at any moment, may find ourselves in this death trap. Luckily, we have a test. Whenever we find that our religious life is making us feel good, feel that we are good, above all, that we are better than anyone else, I think we may be sure that we are being acted on not by God, but by the devil. The real test of being in the presence of God is that you either forget about yourself altogether, or you see yourself as a small, dirty object. It's better to forget about yourself altogether. It's pride that keeps us from responding to God's opportunities that He brings our way. And in Mary, we see none of it. All throughout her song, you see her humility. You see that she knows how big God is. That's what made her so willing to respond to God's opportunity. That's what will allow us to respond to the opportunity God sends to us. Is the more we focus in on the beauty of who God is, of what Christ has done, the bigger He becomes, the more we magnify Him in our lives, the more humble we'll become, the more ready we'll be to jump at His opportunities. And I just sort of started dreaming, what if all of us, at Trinity Chapel, what if all of us, from now to Christmas, every time the Lord interrupted our life, what if we all just said, yes, I'm the Lord's servant, count me in. I want nothing else than to do the bidding of the Lord I love. What if every opportunity that God presented to you to encourage someone, or to challenge someone, to be generous towards someone, what if rather than making 4 or 5 different excuses of why that's not possible, what if we just said, count me in? God, I'm your slave. You bring me an opportunity. I'm going to hold my schedule loosely, and I'm going to follow you. Many of us have names of people that come to mind. People that we sort of feel a nudge from the Lord. I should invite them to church with me. People are more spiritually hungry this time of year. And so there's people that God keeps bringing to your mind, and now we're in that sort of decision phase. Should I or shouldn't I? What are they going to think of me if I... Is that going to mess things up in our relationship? And what if every time the Lord brought someone like that to mind, we just said, yes, God, I'll do it. I'll make the invitation. I'll leave the results in your hands. I think what would happen if we all do that is we'd be blown away. How God would work through all of these different opportunities. I think what would happen is God would be even further magnified. We'd become even more humble. We'd become even more ready to accept any opportunity that comes our way. But let me pray for us, church.